If you want to know how your body works in terms of getting overweight and something that you can use actually to lose weight, then insulin resistance is a subject that you would want to look into. It's quite interesting, and it plays a great role in many patients all over the world, and it's part of the problems that most people are facing nowadays with overweight, obesity, and the complications that we see from there. So I'm Dr. Mazhar Hussain. Do subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell. If you want us to make a movie on a certain subject, let us know. We'll look into it, and maybe we'll make that video. Do share this video with your friends and family. Today we are going to talk about insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is basically a decreased response by the body cells to insulin. Now, insulin keeps our blood glucose level at an appropriate level. It helps to reduce our blood glucose level. Now, if there's a decreased response, it means that the same amount of insulin cannot maintain the blood glucose level where we want it. The blood glucose level is too high. It results into an increased insulin secretion to bring back the blood glucose level where we want it. So, a decreased response by the body cells to insulin, resulting in an increased insulin secretion to maintain appropriate body blood glucose levels. Okay. Now, causes of insulin resistance, they're multiple, and they actually work together, and they're seen often in the same scenario, but there are a number of things that we need to consider. Today we'll be mostly talking about the carbohydrates and the fructose, but they're not the only contributors to insulin resistance. Sedentary lifestyle can lead to insulin resistance or increases the risk of it. Smoking likewise. Lack of exercise, that could be also somewhere related to the sedentary lifestyle, but lack of exercise. If you have low vitamin D levels, it can lead to insulin resistance. Low vitamin D can also lead to sleep disturbances. There are various medicines that could cause insulin resistance. A low omega-3 to omega-6 ratio can also result in insulin resistance. If you see this, the first causes that I've mentioned, they are in green, which is fortunate because those are the ones that we can actively do something about. The genetic factors, we can't do much about what we got in our genetics, but we can actually influence the epigenetics indirectly. So age, well, we can't do much about it, and we probably want it just to go forward rather than the alternative of not getting older. So all of these and others can lead to insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance can then cause a full range of problems, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, polycystic ovaries, infertility, atherosclerosis, dyslipidemia, hypertension, stroke, heart disease, cancers, and so many more, nerve damage. There's so many things that we haven't listed here because it would simply, the list would be too extensive. But I think we have not enough on our plate right now here, so we don't actually need many more reasons to want to know about insulin resistance and to reduce our insulin resistance. I think we got plenty already here. Okay, so what is it? What is it that happens? Well, there's some disagreement, but if you look at this, when you're taking carbs, it leads to insulin secretion. Insulin then stimulates the formation of glycogen and de novo lipogenesis in the liver. That can lead to deposits of fat in the liver, which can lead to an overflow of fat and sugar in the liver cells, and the cells will resist further insulin action, bringing in glucose and bringing in fat into the cells. And if we have a heightened level of glucose in the blood, it can lead to tiredness and we can get hungry. And also if you have an increased level of insulin, it can also lead to inflammation. And this is a vicious cycle. We might then want more carbs, causing more insulin secretion, more glycogen, and fat deposits, fatty liver, overflow, cell becomes even more resistant to insulin, and it's just a vicious cycle. We don't want that. But if we look at these two scenarios here, just hold on a second. Here, the insulin secretion leads to fat deposit. Insulin increases the stimulation and production of triglycerides, fatty acids, and it increases the fat deposits storage in the body. It can be within the pancreas, within the liver, visceral fat, it can be abdominal fat, but fat all over the place really. So insulin can increase that and lead to obesity. And we also have this contribution from fructose. It can also lead to glycogen and de novo lipogenesis. So we have the carbs, but we also have the fructose coming on the side here. So there are essentially two entry points into this. There's the carbohydrates, we'll talk about those, and we'll talk about fructose. Insulin secretion, as we talked about, it uses glucose as, it stimulates the usage of glucose as fuel. It increases the storage of glucose as glycogen in the liver and in the muscle cells. And it promotes the storage of fat, and it inhibits the usage of fat for fuel. It puts fat in the bank box and locks it up, and we can only access the fat, we can only burn the fat when our insulin levels are low. And the insulin levels are low when our glucose levels are low. So that is what carbs do, promotes insulin secretion, and insulin then uses glucose for fuel, glycogen storage is increased, fat storage is increased, and it spares fat from being used. If we have sufficient or surplus amount of glucose and glycogen, then there's a Randle cycle that prevents, where glucose itself prevents fat from being burned, apart from insulin storing fat and preventing from being burned, sparing the fat. There's also a Randle cycle where the glucose itself can hinder the burning of fat. The de novo lipogenesis, if we have sufficient amount of glucose and we got our glycogen stores full, then the de novo lipogenesis kicks in and turns glucose into fat. Well, then we need more insulin to store and hold the additional fat, and to store the additional fat in fat tissue and liver cells, which leads to more insulin resistance. And fructose, as I said, there are two entry points into this vicious cycle. You can see some fruits in the background here. Fructose is what we call kids' beer. It's to a large extent, it has the same fate in the liver. It goes through the same process in the liver. So for the liver, essentially it doesn't make any difference whether it's alcohol or ethanol, and it has the same impact on the liver and the complications and issues we have from there. Well, you don't get drunk, but from the liver's perspective, it's the same. So I call it kids' beer. And others, this is not something I invented, but others. So fructose is more or less only metabolized in the liver. There are a few tissues, testicles, intestines, some places where fructose can be utilized, but generally speaking, it's basically the liver that is responsible. And it does not suppress our appetite as well as glucose does. And it can cause fatty liver disease, as we just saw now, insulin resistant, increased visceral fat, obesity, and the metabolic syndrome. It was thought to be a good carb because it doesn't spike the glucose level, and it has a low glycemic index. But although it doesn't increase the blood glucose level, there are certain reasons for that. We can come into that later. And it was also considered a good carb because it's found in fruit, and we have this general feeling that fruits are really good for us. So anyhow, so in sucrose, in 2 tablespoons of table sugar, that is sucrose. In 2 spoons of table sugar, we got one of them will roughly be glucose and the other would be roughly fructose. So it's nearly 50-50 amount in sucrose. And from the intestine, the fructose is directly taken through the portal vein to the liver, which is one of the reasons we don't really, as we saw it as a good thing. Now, it goes directly to the liver, and keep in mind, mostly metabolized by the liver. So the liver would have the responsibility to utilize, store, metabolize this fructose, while the complete body otherwise is utilizing and metabolizing glucose. Fructose is not the case. So all of a sudden, the liver would have 1 teaspoon, the whole body will take care of, that's the glucose, and the other teaspoon, only the liver can manage that. If we are in the fat state and we got sufficient amount of glucose, then fructose can be turned into glycogen. But again, if we have enough glucose, glucose can be turned into glycogen. So what's left? Fatty acid, triglycerides, fat tissue, just going to increase. So fructose increases the formation of glycogen, de novo lipogenesis, which is just another word of new production of fats. It leads to fatty liver, the liver cells are full, and it just then goes into, leads to liver cell insulin resistance. We don't like that. So fructose increases cholesterol, fatty acids, triglycerides, VLDL. The fats go up. It's not a good thing for us. Uric acid goes up. What can it lead to? Gout and hypertension. We don't like that. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, certainly not something we like. Insulin resistance, obesity and metabolic syndrome. Visceral fat, liver and pancreas, and fat in muscle. It increases inflammation. There's hardly anything to like about fructose. So let's look at fructose and fatty liver disease. In this study, they followed a number of overweight people over a period of time, and after 18 months, some of those people developed diabetes. They fulfilled the criteria of diabetes, and then they separated those two groups, the ones that developed diabetes and the ones that didn't develop diabetes. And so at their blood tests, so if you have at the time where they developed diabetes, if you look at here, and then the 18 months previous, so you can see that although ALT, which is a measure of liver damage or fatty liver, although it started out from 26, 27, it went up to 32, which is important. This is still within the normal range for most labs. This is within the normal range for most labs. But you can see there's already a development happening here within the past 18 months from 26, 27 up to 32, around that. But the people that didn't develop diabetes, they are quite steady there, what they were before also. And even here, if you look at this, this is just where they were doing the blood test. But even at 18 months, they start out from a higher point. So had we gone further back in time, if we had the blood test then, we would again see that there was probably an increase even before the 18 months. And keep in mind, this again is within the normal limit. Even the 32 here is within the normal limit for most labs' reference values. So just because something is within a reference value doesn't mean that it's okay. And keep in mind, the reference value in many labs includes people that actually have fatty liver disease, that are overweight and therefore already have this issue, but is not yet diagnosed. So if you ask a person who is overweight, who hasn't been to the doctors or hasn't been diagnosed, are you healthy? And he says yes, well, that will be counted into our normal range. Anyhow, so this just goes to see fatty liver disease precedes type 2 diabetes. And insulin resistance, again, glucose and fructose, which is the table sugar, leads to fatty liver and it leads to insulin resistance. How do we treat insulin resistance? Well, as you see from the vicious cycle we had, we need to minimize carbs, we need to minimize fructose, And we really need to minimize kids' beer. Now, Kellogg's cornflakes, even the multigrain or Weetabix, the whole grain, it's just carbs. It's really nothing else but carbs. It's really super unhealthy. It's kids' beer. Most cereals would contain a huge amount of carbohydrates. And I really don't want my kids to have that. And for all practical purposes, for the liver, it's equivalent to alcohol. How do we again reduce the amount of insulin released? By minimize carbs, taking moderate amount of protein, and taking more fat. If we go over here, we can see that if we take low glycemic food, we'll spike our blood glucose less. Low glycemic food, proteins and fats, they are low glycemic. Whole foods are low glycemic. If we take low glycemic food, we'll spike our insulin less. It will spike our blood glucose less, and will spike our insulin less. If you take high glycemic food, and what is high glycemic? Well, nearly everything that we eat today, most of that what modern households take in, we spike our blood glucose and we spike our insulin. The insulin overcorrects and the blood glucose level drops under the dotted line, and we start feeling hungry, we want to eat again. And this is a vicious cycle. After 3, 4 hours, 5 hours, we want to eat again. While if we have low glycemic food, we don't go below the dotted line. We don't get the cravings. We don't want to eat again after 3, 4 hours. But here, the high glycemic food, the soft drinks, the fast food, the chocolate, the cakes, the milkshakes, the smoothies, the bread, the pasta, the rice, all of this is over here. We are spiking our insulin tremendously and we are in trouble. Okay, I talked about Kellogg's multigrain just before. Let's look at it in terms of numbers. So 87 carbohydrates, and out of that 10 grams nearly of dietary fibers. Now I'm being nice to Kellogg's multigrain. So net carbs, 87 minus 10, 77 grams of net carbs. That is 15.5 teaspoons of sugar. 15.5 teaspoons of sugar we are feeding to our kids or eating ourselves. That is simply going to spike your insulin tremendously. Tremendously. We are over here. We are over here. Absolutely over here. And if you go into Weetabix whole grain, what's the situation then? We got 82 grams of carbohydrates, 11 grams of dietary fibers, 71 grams of net carbs, 14 teaspoons of sugar. How is that really going to be healthy for us? How are our body going to manage that? It's simply not good for us. It's not good for our kids. So we buy this and pay a huge amount. And we believe that maybe this is healthy and it's good for our kids, and Weetabix whole grain, Kellogg's multigrain, but it's not good. It's highly damaging. We don't want this in our food. And certainly we don't want our kids at an early age, 20, 25, 22, 18, to have diabetes type 2 diabetes, or have fatty liver disease, or have hypertension or heart disease when they're 32. It's not what we want for our kids. And we are paying quite a good amount of money to buy these items for them. So look at eggs, for instance. What's the situation here? And well, eggs, we got 0.8 grams of carbohydrates. We got 14 grams of protein. We got 15 grams of fat. Well, this is low glycemic food. There's hardly any spike in glucose here. Very moderate spike in glucose. We'll stay full for longer. We won't have the need to eat something again after 3-4 hours because we got more protein, we got more fat, and we'll stay full. Mozzarella is the same story, a little 2.2 grams of carbohydrates, but 22 grams of protein, 22 grams of fat. Well, we'll stay full for quite a while. If we take avocado with this, well, we won't probably want to see food again for the next 10-12 hours. So these are the kind of foods we want, proteins and fat, where we don't burden our body with all this unhealthy cereals with a huge amount of carbohydrates, a huge amount of sugar in it, a huge amount of fructose. So this concludes our video on insulin resistance. There's so much more to say about it, but we have to stop somewhere. Do let us know if you have any suggestions for videos we should make, and I do suggest, if you couldn't follow this, you can see our video on the normal blood glucose level and carbs and proteins and fats. It will give you a better understanding of what we're talking about today. If you do subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and share this video with your friend and family. Thank you for now.